Hi, good morning Year 12, I hope you're doing well. This week we're going to be taking a look at your last week of Russian Revolution work in Year 12 with me, and your last week of British Empire work with Miss Durnford. After half term, which is next week if like me you've completely lost track of time, after half term, for the last 7 weeks up until the summer, whether we're in school or not, fingers crossed we are in school, we're going to be starting the coursework. So that'll be looking at the causes of the witch craze. So me and Miss Durnford will be giving you some contextual knowledge about the witch craze, as well as giving you a little bit of training about how you can start to do the further and wider research about it. But to kind of get back to today's focus, today we're going to do this lesson 13, where it's the causes and events of the February Revolution of 1917. Then on Wednesday I'm going to pose your last Russian Revolution lesson of Year 12, lesson 14, the dual authority and the November Revolution. Now the way this lesson is going to work today is I'm going to give you about 7 or 8 big questions that recap the causes and events of the February Revolution pretty much in order. And the way it's going to work is I'm going to pose this question, then you're going to answer it from memory in as much depth as you can. Then I'm going to give you some picture clues to hopefully help you. Then I'm going to give you some keyword clues, again, to help you again. Then I'm going to talk you through the answer in depth. So it's one of those revision lessons where as much as possible you're working your memory, you're getting a bit of help, you're working your memory, a little bit more help, working your memory, then go through the answers correctly. The way to do the lesson is, as always, you can do it directly into this document you should see now on your screen, where you'll have the question, you write your answer, so on, so on, so on. Or, like I say, if it's easier, you can play this video on your computer and answer the questions on paper. Then at the end, just take a picture of them and submit that into Google Classroom. Whatever's easiest for you. If you've got a computer and you can play the video on a screen, do it in the document. If you've only got a computer, play the video in the computer and do it on paper. Or have the video open in one window and then the document open in another and type it in. Whatever works best for you. Now we're going to jump straight in with our inquiry question for today's lesson. Really big, really broad. It's this one here. Why did Russia's government have such delicate control of the country from March 1917? Why did Russia's government have such delicate control of the country from March 1917? Can you start by doing that what do you already know? I've put on the screen a few little prompt questions to help you with your what do you already know. But pause this video now, take a good few minutes, rack your memory, think back to the timeline last week, write down as much as you can. Pause this video now, go. Excellent. So, I'm not going to go through this with you at the moment because this whole lesson today is going to answer that question. Then at the very, very end, you're going to come back to it and answer it in hopefully even more depth than you have just said. So keep it in mind. The story we're looking at is why the Russian government had such delicate control of the country from March 1917. Now, in order to do this, we need to first look at what the Russian government was like before 1917. So your first question that's going to help you answer the wider inquiry question is this. How was the Russian government organised in early 1917? Pause the video and empty your head. Okay, now the step where I'm going to give you some clues. So I'm going to put some images on the board, or on the screen I should say. I'd like you to change colour pen or change font colour if you're doing it in the document. Look at these images. How do they help you to answer the question? Pause the video and try and add more detail. Okay, I'm now going to talk you through in a bit more depth the answer to this question. Change your colour again, maybe to a darker green or a lighter green, but something to show you're now listening to me talk you through it. I'm going to tell you what the Russian government was like. Now, the head of the Russian government was that man there on the left, Tsar Alexander II. And he had almost complete control over the Russian government. It was very much a strong autocratic country. Now on the right, you'll see a couple of images that are hopefully going to remind you of the Russian Duma. Now the Russian Duma was a lot like a parliament. It had some elements of democracy. It had been established after the 1905 revolts, and it was created to kind of give a sense that the people had some element of representative influence over the government. But the Duma was not very powerful at all. Tsar Nicholas II had very much most of the power. So the organisation with Tsar Nicholas II being the strong autocratic ruler. There existed a Duma allowing some representative democracy, but it was not very powerful at all. Right, we're now going to take a look at question 2. How secure was the Russian government in early 1917? Why was it secure or why was it insecure? And what happened in the years before to shape the position of the Russian government? Pause this video now and empty your head back in your first colour of what you can remember. Thank you very much. Again, I've got some clues for you, so change colour. Here are some images. Pause the video, look closely, take a few minutes, try and look closely at the images. I've chosen them carefully to try and remind you of a few things. Pause the video and fill in what you can now. Excellent. Now this time I've got some keywords for you. Now I don't want you to just type in the keywords, try and expand upon them. What do the key terms relate to? Can you, if they're an event, can you describe the event? Is it a person? Is it an institution? Can you describe it? Pause the video and use these keywords to help you fill in the gaps. Excellent. Right, I'm going to talk you through now. I'm going to go through step by step a bit more of an in-depth answer to this question. So, effectively, the government was suffering in early 1917 from a weakening of its authority. Tsar Nicholas was a particularly weak and insecure ruler that did not have the confidence of the people. In terms of his personality and his personal life, he was a naturally shy, awkward politician. He was quite bored by political affairs. He wasn't a natural leader in those respects. He didn't really believe in democracy. He believed in the divine right to rule. The idea that he'd almost been chosen by God like a king, and he had the sole right to rule over Russia. So he didn't want to interact or engage with cooperation with the Duma. It's one of the reasons why that parliament was so weak. His personal life also damaged his authority. For example, the controversy surrounding his wife, Tsarina Alexandra. She was a woman of German heritage, which especially during the First World War delegitimized him and his wife. Also, there was a controversy surrounding her relationship with the spiritual advisor Rasputin. All of this very much damaged the Tsar's position. Now, as I mentioned there as well, there's also the crisis surrounding the First World War, which Russia had joined in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Russia joining that war to help defend the Serbians. This aligned Russia on the side of Britain and France, fighting against Germany and the Empire of Austria-Hungary. Now, the majority of the war went really badly for the Russians. For example, just to give you one kind of flavour of this, there was the Battle of Tannenberg, which left 30,000 Russian soldiers dead or wounded. In total, around 12 million Russians had been mobilised into the army, and those 12 million soldiers were incredibly poorly equipped. Everything from weapons, clothing and food. they struggled to get a hold of. You may remember, this is one fact that always sticks out when I think about this, is that the Russian soldiers struggled with only 2 rifles for every 3 soldiers on average. Obviously putting the army in a really weak position, and meaning those soldiers didn't have confidence in the leadership of the country. Now, the crisis of the First World War also created other reasons why the people of Russia were starting to lose confidence in the Tsar. For example, from July 1914, the Tsar started to reorganise how the government was organised throughout Russia to help put it in a position which he thought would win the First World War. Now, previously, as I've mentioned, there was some democratic representation and some democratic control of government. It was especially weak, but it did exist. It was a little bit stronger in local government, where the people, where the businesses and the peasants did have some influence in how the local government was organised. Now, in order to help the war effort, Tsar Nicholas weakened this. And he started to set up military zones where the civilian democratic control was taken away. He thought that removing this would allow the military to have more control and be better prepared and better equipped. He was doing it, on the face of it, to try and win the First World War. But do remember that he also doesn't really believe in democracy anyway. Now, the people responded to this lack of control by setting up the Zemgor. Now, the Zemgor was the all-Russian union of zemstva and cities. And it was chaired by this man here, Prince Lvov. It was made up of the local Duma representatives and the workers, and this Zemgor basically campaigned and essentially insisted to help and advise the government in the war effort. They wanted to try and have some representative influence over how Russia were responding to the First World War. Now, Tsar Nicholas rejected this. He didn't believe in democracy. He thought civilian influence would slow down their response to the war. And this then starts to delegitimise the Tsar in the eyes of the people. He's rejecting those democratic influences into the war effort. Obviously, he's going to turn more people against him. Again, then, a similar thing happened in 1915, where there was an offer to create a government of public confidence, which would have essentially shared power between this government of confidence, which would have had some representativeness, that have shared power with the Tsar. Again, though, the Tsar rejected this offer. This would have calmed down a lot of the criticisms he was receiving, but he rejected it. Now, alongside this consistent rejection of democratic or representative features, the Tsar really kind of doubles down on his unpopularity as the First World War continues. Now, in September 1915, after several heavy defeats for the Russian army, he decides to appoint himself the Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Army and Navy. He gives himself more control on how the military is organised. He takes a lot of power away from the more experienced military commanders, even though the Tsar himself had very little military experience, almost no real expertise. He was not a man who you would normally expect to be a good military leader. And would you believe it, he did a very bad job leading the military after September 1915. And the problem that this also created for him is it meant that he was now, his legitimacy and his kind of the confidence that people had in him was now tied very closely to how Russia was doing in the war. It meant now that if Russia had any other failures, that failure would be tied very closely to the Tsar himself. So again, the dissatisfied soldiers who were unhappy about their lack of equipment, just the people in general who saw Russia struggling in the war, now blame the Tsar very, very, directly. Now, this lack of legitimacy, again, is kind of doubled down even further by the weaknesses in the Russian economy. Now, during the war, the Russians had an extraordinarily weak economy. Huge amounts of taxation increases were charged on the people in order to pay for the war. Huge loans were taken out by the government, putting the whole country in incredible debt to pay for the war. This also leads to the problem of inflation, which makes life very, very difficult for the peasants in Russia. Because food becomes more expensive, the cost of things the cost of things were rising much quicker than the rise of wages. You've got a similar situation as you studied in the hyperinflation crisis of Weimar Germany during your GCSE. The final thing that's really delegitimizing the Tsar is the problem of the railways. Now, the First World War is a war where a country's ability to keep a railway infrastructure running is incredibly important. The railways were used by all the nations pretty much to move soldiers around to different points of the front line, up and down the trenches. So a strong railway network meant you could move your soldiers quickly. The Russian railway network was starting to crumble. This was putting a lot of pressure on the military. But also, the infrastructure of the railway is used like any economy to move goods around. So this makes it harder and harder for food to be moved around Russia to feed just the people as well. So again, this has got the problem, both economic and military, where the Tsar is starting to look like a real failure. So as you can see there are lots of reasons why, in early 1917, the Tsar is in an incredibly weak position. He's losing legitimacy. The soldiers are starting to desert the armies, start to walk away from the front because they've lost confidence in the leadership. The people, the peasants, have lost confidence because of the state of the economy and how difficult their lives are. And the opposition groups are getting more and more frustrated by the Tsar's repeated rejection to allow elements of democracy and civilian input in the government. Excellent. So this is leading us now to the events of 1917. And my question for you here is, what were the events of the Russian Revolution? Where did the revolution take place? Pause this video now, back in your original colour, empty your head please. Fantastic, now that you've emptied your head, again I've got some clues for you. Here's your first set of clues, you've got some images. Now these images tell the story in order. So this is the first one in the top left, second one, third, and then it goes down here, 4, 5, 6. Look closely at the images. Can you remember these events? Pause the video now and look closely. Okay, again, here are some key words. Make sure to change colour pen, or highlight, or change colour font. Pause the video now and use the words to answer as much more of the question as you can. Fantastic. Right, now I'm going to talk you through again. Fill in the gaps, add anything you had forgotten before, but I'm going to tell you the broad brushstrokes of the events of the February Revolution. Now, the revolution started on Monday the 14th of February, when 100,000 workers from around 58 factories go on strike in Petrograd. And these 100,000 workers, as they were tried to be controlled by the police, the workers start to kind of respond and oppose that control from the police with some violence. Then a week later, on Thursday the 23rd of February, International Women's Day, there were the traditional marches taking place to celebrate International Women's Day. Now, when those marches take place, they are joined and their numbers are swelled by 90,000 striking workers from 50 Petrograd factories, and those 50 factories were forced to close by the strikers. The marches were also joined by militant students and women who were had become frustrated by the length of the bread queues. They all joined this march, and the city effectively on the 23rd of February falls into chaos as around 240,000 people are marching on the streets. This is what you can see in the second image. Now, by Friday the 24th of February, there are 200,000 workers on strike in Petrograd, joining the marches for all those reasons we spoke about in question 2. There's lots of reasons why the Russians were unhappy, why they'd want to protest, why they'd want to strike. Now, at this point, the crowd start to attack Tsarist statues. They start to, in some elements, wave the red flag of communism, and they start to shout revolutionary slogans calling for the end of Tsarism. The tension you can see is creeping up at each event. Now, what's interesting about this revolution is there are no clear signs of leadership. There's not one person or one group organising, leading speeches, leading the marches. It's very much kind of bottom up, the people joining them, the strikes growing, the marches growing as so many people are dissatisfied. Now, this crisis for the Tsarist regime in Petrograd continues to get worse. On Saturday, the 25th of February, around 250,000 people, to give you some scale, that's about half the Petrograd workforce, were on strike. Almost all the factories and shops had to be closed. There were no newspapers, no public transport running, and the violence is escalating. A man called Shalfiv, the leader of the mounted police, he tries to lead the police to control the masses, and he was attacked by the crowds, he was dragged from his horse, and he was shot. And at this point, the Cossacks, which is the name we use for the mounted police, you've got a picture of them here in kind of traditional clothes, the Cossacks refused to attack the strikers when they were ordered to do so. And you have to remember, many of those Cossacks are being ordered to maybe attack crowds that their family might be in. As well, remember that many of the Cossacks might have some of the lack of confidence that the people have had as well. They see the crisis of the war. They might have started to lose faith in the Tsarist as well, and they start to decide not to attack the strikers. And this is kind of the first step in where things come crumbling down for the Tsar, because the police, one of the tools that a Tsar would have had to control his people, isn't working anymore because they're choosing not to kind of back him up. Then, on the 26th of February, a Sunday, this man here, Rodzianko, the president of the Duma, a man who is kind of a symbol of kind of civilian control or almost elements of democracy, Rodzianko, a man who has some legitimacy to represent the people, sends a telegram to the Tsar warning him of the kind of severity of the situation in Petrograd, and Tsar Nicholas ignores it. In fact, rather than listen to Rodzianko, the Tsar orders the Duma to dissolve, ending any element of civilian control of government or civilian influence in government, and giving himself full control again. Then on Monday the 27th of February, the Tsar orders the commander of the Petrograd military to restore control using force and effectively all-out violence to essentially attack the protesters and strikers in Petrograd. Soldiers were ordered onto the streets, and about 40 protesters were killed in the fighting. However, the Volhynsky regiment mutiny. the Volynski regiment refused to follow those orders. They refused to fire and attack the protesters and strikers. Instead, the Volynski regiment shoot their commanding officers as an act of defiance. And 66,000 soldiers actually joined the protesters, many of them taking their weapons with them, taking 40,000 rifles to now arm the protesters. The police headquarters are attacked by the strikers and protesters, and the prisons are opened up. The Duma, now in defiance, organises a 12-man provisional committee to seize control and power over the government. And that evening, the revolutionaries of the workers striking, they set up a Soviet. Now remember, Soviet effectively means council. They set up a council which they intend to take control over the government. And the Soviets begin organising food supplies for the city. So you've now got the position where the Tsar has basically lost control of Petrograd. The soldiers of the Volynski regiment have mutinied. They've given their weapons to the protesters. The Duma have kind of self-appointed this provisional 12-man committee to lead the government. But at the same time, the elements of the protesters and the workers, they've also set up the Soviet councils to lead the country as well. So not only have they lost control of Petrograd, but these other rival governments are being set up, fighting for control of Russia and Petrograd. Now on Tuesday, the 28th of February, Tsar Nicholas leaves his military headquarters, and at this point, he offers to make a deal with the Duma. He offers to share control. He's kind of offering the thing that the Zemgor had wanted in the years before. The leader of the Duma, Rodzianko, he replies with the message, "The measures you propose are too late. The time for them has gone. There is no return." And the Tsar has very much acted too late. He could have shared power in the past, but now the Provisional Committee, the Duma, the Soviets are all in a moment where they think, actually, we can grasp full control. We don't need the Tsar anymore at all. And the Tsar, he never returned to Petrograd. He actually makes an agreement that would set up his son to be the new Tsar. Now, his son was too young, so while his son was coming of adult age, the Tsar's brother would effectively be the regent. The Tsar's brother, Mikhail, would kind of control Russia alongside the Duma until the Tsar's son was old enough. However, funnily enough, the Tsar's brother, Mikhail, he rejected that offer of regency, and instead Mikhail decides to effectively end 304 years of the Romanov dynasty over Russia. And Tsar Nicholas is put under house arrest. Excellent. Right, your next question, after looking at those events, and after that, that is very much the two longest questions over and done with. The next 4 or 5 are quite a bit shorter as we look at what the situation is like after the February Revolution. So question 4 is, I mentioned before that the February Revolution was very much bottom up and didn't have clear-cut leaders. So my question for you now is, why could the February Revolution be considered to be leaderless? Who were the people who could have potentially been leaders, and why didn't they lead this sort of revolution? Pause the video and answer the question. Okay, again, I've got some clues for you. There you go. Take a look at these images, change colour, and answer the question. Excellent. Right, so I'll talk you through who these men are, what their position would have been as potential leaders of the revolution, and why they weren't there. So your first man on the left is a man I really hope you recognise. That is Lenin. Now, Lenin, who is somebody who, if you look into him, and I've been reading quite a bit about Lenin recently, is somebody who has a long history, not just himself, but also in his family, of revolutionary action in Russia. In fact, decades before this, Lenin's brother had been executed for his role in trying to assassinate a Tsar. Now, Lenin was one of these left-wing leaders, was somebody who wanted Russia to be a communist country. And because of his position as a left-wing leader, he'd been exiled from Russia, and he was living in Zurich at the time. Similarly, the man in the middle, Trotsky, another of the left-wing leaders in Russia, he'd also been exiled to New York because the Tsar was unwilling to have people with those views in the country. Then the man on the right is Viktor Chernov. Now, Chernov was the leader of the social revolutionaries in the Duma in the early 1900s. And because of his position as outspoken critic of the Tsar and left-wing person, he'd been as well exiled to Paris. And the speed of the events of the February Revolution, they were so quick and they were so bottom-up that these three men couldn't really respond in time. And it's one of the reasons why it was very much kind of a bottom-up revolution without these sorts of revolutionary and charismatic leaders in place. And this leads us nicely then, this kind of chaos of the February Revolution, to question 5. So what type of government did the Tsar leave behind? Now, I mentioned that the Tsar appointed his brother Mikhail as this regent, as somebody who was going to kind of take over power and try and strike a deal that would have settled the revolution. What do you remember about that? Pause this video, take a good few minutes, think as hard as you can, and empty your head. Okay, and again, I've got some clues for you. Take a look at these clues, pause the video and empty your head. Remember to change colour. And then again, I've got some images, I've got some keywords for you too. Pause the video, read them carefully. Can you match them to the images? How do they answer the question? Okay, fantastic. I'll talk you through it then. So, the Tsar Nicholas's brother, Mikhail, as I said, he rejected this offer of the position as a regency, and he decided to give up the political authority given to him by Tsar Nicholas, and he gave that authority to a provisional government. And this provisional government was kind of put together in a very rushed manner. Now, it would be controlled, it would be led by Prince Lvov, a man who had some legitimacy for his position in the aristocracy, but he also had some legitimacy because of his work leading things like Zemgor before. He was kind of seen as a middleman between the old aristocratic control and the brief elements of democratic control. He was, like I say, a wealthy aristocrat himself. And much of his provisional government was made up by other wealthy aristocrats. And they wanted a return to strong constitutional monarchy. They wanted to return to a situation where power in Russia was shared by a monarch, a Tsar most likely, with a Duma. So it would have been a step closer to democracy, but the provisional government, essentially, at their head, was not campaigning for full democracy or communism or anything like that. It was a mild change from what had gone on before. Now, the provisional government was supposed to be a temporary government. And it was supposed to take charge until a constituent assembly could be elected. And that constituent assembly would have the job of writing the new constitution of Russia. Constitution being the rule book for how the government was organised. And this provisional government was set up in the right wing of the Tauride Palace in Petrograd, the former chamber of the Duma. Now, what's interesting about this story is I really hope you're starting to spot a lot of parallels to the story of the Weimar Republic. After World War I, when you studied this in GCSE, it's a very similar picture in the Weimar Republic when the Kaiser abdicates, a constituent assembly is elected, they write a new constitution, and that constitution is the constitution of the Weimar Republic, which you studied all the way through GCSE. It's a similar pattern, a similar structure here. Although, as you can hopefully remember, it doesn't kind of go any stretch of the imagination as a similar story of the Weimar Republic. And the reason why this attempt to get a constitutional democracy doesn't work is because of question 6, to a large extent. How did the Soviets, those councils set up by the workers, respond to the Provisional Government, and why were the Soviets able to retain some power? Why didn't the Provisional Government take all authority and all control of the government? Why did the Soviets continue to exist after the February Revolution? Empty your head about what you remember now. Lovely. Here are some clues. Look at the images carefully. Now, actually, to help you, that first image, I've got a larger version here. You can see the how closely packed together the people are in this room, in this arcing shape. What do you think this room is? How does that help you answer the question? Pause the video and empty your head. Okay, so the Petrograd Soviet, the council which was kind of there to represent the workers, agreed, under some pressure from the military, that each military regiment would be able to elect its own committees, and those regiment committees would then send representatives to the Soviet in Petrograd. This agreement gave the military representation in the decision-making of the Soviet in return for giving the Soviet political control over the military. So what you have here is kind of an agreement between the workers' Soviets and the military. And that agreement does actually have some benefits for both groups. It gives the military some decision-making control over the Soviet and how it will act going forward. But also it strengthens the Soviet because now they've got the military on their side and you've got all the force that goes along with that. This then became known, the Petrograd Soviet became known as the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies. Now they were uncomfortable with the makeup of the Provisional Government led by Lvov that we talked about in question 5. They didn't like how closely the people on that committee had worked with the Tsar in the past. They didn't like the aristocratic elements of it, and they weren't convinced that they would lead a government that would be representative of the people. They were wealthy, they were self-appointed, they were not the sort of groups that you would expect to have the interests of the workers at heart. So, the Soviet kind of set it up as a rival for power in many ways, and they set themselves up in the left wing of the Tauride Palace. Now, the Soviets were primarily made up of socialists, Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, and a small number of the Bolsheviks as well. Now, this situation where we've got two groups claiming authority over Russia, claiming to be able to take control of the government, the Soviet and the Provisional Government, leads us finally to question 7, which is here. How was cooperation between the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet arranged? How did they view Russia's continuing role in World War I? Pause the video and answer the final question from memory. Lovely. Right, here are some clues to help you. Can you remember who that man is? Pause the video and empty your head. Excellent. Right, I'm going to go through this for you. One last question. Well done for sticking with it this long. Let's go through it. So, that man there is Kerensky. And Kerensky was the only member of both the Petrograd Soviet and the Provisional Government. He was appointed to both. Now, he negotiated an agreement for the Soviet and the Provisional Government to work closely together. And this would be known as the dual authority. In the agreement, the Provisional Government promised an amnesty for political prisoners, civil liberties and freedoms, greater equality for the different classes, religions and nationalities. They promised the freedom to organise trade unions and to strike. And they promised the election of a constituent assembly in the future, and that constituent assembly would determine the future of Russia. Now, this agreement was made to kind of ease the fears of the Soviets that they had about the Provisional Government and find a way that they could work together. Now, this agreement was always going to be incredibly delicate. It was never going to be a strong agreement. The Provisional Government represented much of the old Tsarist system. It was made up of the aristocrats who wanted a constitutional monarchy, whereas the Petrograd Soviet wanted to represent the interests of those who were less well off in Russia. In terms of the First World War, the Provisional Government wanted a continued, dedicated commitment to carry on in the First World War. For example, they wanted to discipline army deserters. They wanted a strong, all-out war effort to win. The Provisional Government felt strongly that they should honour the alliance with Britain and France, especially because Russia relied so heavily on French loans for survival. Whereas the Soviets thought that the war should be ended quickly. They wanted the war ended without giving up any territory to the Germans, because the Soviets wanted to represent the interests of the peasants, the workers and the soldiers who the Soviets viewed were suffering because of the events of the First World War. And that's where we're going to carry on from on Wednesday. We're going to take a look at the events of the dual authority, how it controls delicately throughout 1917, and then the changes that obviously come in the October Revolution. Now, I do want you to just summarise this lesson by taking one final look at the inquiry question we started with. I'd like a developed answer to this, maybe a paragraph or two, that's just going to help you put all of that information we've just been to over the last sort of hour and a half into one thoughtful answer, looking at what was happening before 1917, the events of the February Revolution, and then the position of what's left over. Now, that's been an awful lot of information for us to cover in one session. I hope you've found the depth and detail easier, been able to put the story together again. Can I also say that overall I've been still really, really impressed by the efforts you've been putting in, especially last week with that big timeline project. It was really interesting for me, kind of looking through your notes and seeing how well you've been doing to motivate yourselves to get that revision done. So answer the question finally, and I look forward to sharing with you Wednesday's lesson when we look at the events of the dual authority and the revolution. Well done. As always, drop me an email if you have any questions or if there's anything I can do to help. Then again, remember, if there's any of this you want to dig a bit more deeper into, or you're finding interesting, or you want to know more about it, at the bottom of the document, you've got quite a few of different stretch resources. You've got a pretty good 45-minute big picture lecture on the February Revolution. And then you've got a handful of different readings looking at Russia before 1917, the downfall of the Tsar, and then a few looking at the events of the revolution, and some of those people I've mentioned in a bit more depth. Now, as always, there's no expectation that you have to read those. It's very much for if you're interested in, or if there's a particular area where you think you've got a bit of a gap. Have a good week.